question too. So in 2020, big year, Portlanders voted overwhelmingly to institute the Portland Street Response as an alternative emergency response for vulnerable Portlanders experiencing crisis. Despite the Portland Street Response popularity and the expectation that the program would eventually evolve to a 24-hour service, 24-hour and 7 days a week service, the budget has been under attack for over 2 years, resulting in slashing of the budget and really slow down that implementation. We're going to start with you first. I would love to know, the question is, it's not a big one, but it is a big one, two-part. Where do you see the Portland Street Response within the context of public safety? Maybe a good opportunity to bring back that budget conversation. Yeah. And then second part to that, what are your plans to ensure the future of the Portland Street Response and its services? You have 2 minutes.
Beautiful. So I'm definitely in support of fully funding Portland Street Response, making sure that it has 24/7 services. And other cities have multiple alternative emergency services, so I would honestly like to see more of Portland Street Response. Like, it doesn't just need to be one thing. It could be a grouping of things. And I think that, so police and fire have their own bureau, and I'd really like to see alternative services have their own bureau as well. And that would help them with sort of the balance of power and a full recognition that they are community safety specialists. And I think that they represent people who are very trauma-informed, are coming at the situation with a lot of empathy, and are not coming to a crisis with criminalization as a tool in their toolkit. And I think that's really important, because for me, crime is a cry for help. And it shouldn't be treated with punishment, it should be treated with healthcare. Or housing, or or really just asking the person, what is it that you need to feel resourced right now? What is it you feel that you need to feel safe? And so for me, yes, Portland Street Response is amazing, and we need to be definitely pushing that fully. And it has a lot of public support. Like, it's a lot of citizens support it, and the public officials have talked about cutting budgets in every category. And I think it goes back to that priority conversation of, do we want to spend money on graffiti removal, or do we want people to have trauma-informed healthcare on the streets when they're experiencing crisis? And I do a lot of mutual aid work, and from the houseless community that I've been interacting with, they talk a lot about experiencing police violence, about having a panic attack at even the mere sight of a police uniform. And and then we have a situation where downtown businesses are hiring their own security forces, which is causing a lot of problems. And so having a standard in the city and the community of how are we approaching these issues, how are we approaching it with empathy, how are we approaching it as human beings, fellow human beings to each other.
Thank you. Same question. What do you see the Portland Street Response within the context of public safety, and what are your plans to ensure the future of the Portland Street Response and its services? You also have 2 minutes.
Joy, at the transition, you made the point that not only did we not defund the police, which is a popular talking point, it's wrong, but it's a popular one, but we've been increasing the budget. Just this last budget cycle, I think it went up another $20 million. That was in the same hearing that, I don't know, dozens, there was a long line out the door of people testifying in support of Portland Street Response. And that $20 million would be enough to fund it 24/7, give it the resources it needs to fulfill its mandate, and put it on its trajectory to scale where we need to be. I mean, it really should be a resource that you have multiple teams who can deploy at a moment's notice to deal with kind of a trust-based, medical-based, and trauma-based approach. That is the future, and we need to stand by that. I agree with Andrew that it should be an independent bureau at the same standing that police and fire are, and other elements of community safety. I'll also note that it's good economics. Like, you can get federal matching if you fully fund this thing. And when voters say we want this, it's a slap in the face when the commissioner who runs that bureau says, I'm going to go to work breaking it out of grievance for the former commissioner, because that's what happened. And I'll just say that. And so we want, voters are ready for a functional government, and so we can't have leaders who go in smashing things they don't like because they disagree with it, because it represents a kind of politics they hate. So, Portland Street Response for me is bigger than just its function, it's also sort of emblematic of the change we're trying to make at an institutional level in this city. And so I like that a lot of candidates, I like that Andrew's standing behind it, I like that there's a whole pledge behind it, I was proud to sign it. And we absolutely need to make sure we don't put duties on PSR that violate their charter and try to make them do policing type of activities.
Let's get into that. We have some time. Let's talk more about it. I want to go back to you because you threw this idea around, having it be separate. And I know a lot of us at first, including myself, had a moment. I was excited at first that this was going to be under the fire department and not the police. And it didn't work. There's a lot of folks being asked to do things outside of their scope. Really policing by another name. Can you explain a little bit more about this idea of having this possibly be a separate office or bureau?
Yeah, so I think that would be really important both to lessen the requirements on the fire department, because obviously they're a really important service and we need to make sure that they are fully resourced and are not having to negotiate, dispatch of the Portland Street Response. So just from we need our first responders to have all the time that they can from that perspective, but also so that Portland Street Response can set its own terms and be its own bureau and make sure that it's holding true to its values and its virtues. And that might require some charter change also. And like having read the Portland Charter is really interesting because over a fourth of this 200-page document talks about police and fire retirement fund. So, and that's the constitution for our city. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but it's very interesting that so much time is spent on that in our city constitution. And so I guess when we talk about these standalone bureaus, I think it's also important to look at the bureau structure as a whole and say, are we interacting with these structures well? Is that really, how do we want to make sure that, police and fire work? And then, how do we create an equal structure for the three of them? So yeah, and I do think it's time, well past time, as we saw in 2020, to really look at our historical community safety options and look at the fact that policing has caused a lot of harm. And it came out of the desire to catch runaway slaves. Like that's how this organization was formed. And so I don't know that you can recover from that. I really want to ask questions about, okay, I feel like these police officers are afraid of losing their jobs, and that's valid. I understand that fear, but how can we retrain you? How can we do de-escalation training and healthcare training and trauma-informed training and shift you into a different role that is safer for everyone involved?
Thank you for that. I want to pass that same question. Just what do you think about this idea of the standalone office? You alluded to a little bit before.
Yeah, so the way I approach this kind of stuff is I don't have a preconceived model for organizationally where something should fit. Like it depends upon the data and the experience. And I think what we have seen is PSR was not really allowed to flourish in its organizational chart. And so, I take the lead of champions, both inside of PSR and also friends of PSR who are advancing a position that says, well, I think what we need to see it succeed is its independence. And that gets to this concept that I talk a lot about when I'm campaigning called administrative capacity. So it's like boring stuff, but basically it's just like, does your bureau work? Does it stand behind the workers who are working for it? Do you have the institutions and the regulations in place to allow it to do its mission? And if the answer to those questions are no, then you have to say, what can we do to change it? I do believe that if we said, let's put it into its own independent position, let's give it its own accountability structure, because accountability is a two-way street, right? Then we have the opportunity to test it. And I believe that with the resources and the independence, the folks who work there believe so strongly in this work. They self-select into it. It's really hard work, and they're still there. And I think it's just gonna make a huge impact on our city. It's gonna really help us leverage the other parts of the whole mental health and addiction and homelessness spectrum that we would love to have the police avoid. Like I don't want the police to touch that at all. That's not what they're good at. They're good at showing up and shooting someone. maybe that's a little spicy, but I mean, I feel like that's what they're trained to do. When they get training, it's like warrior cop stuff. It is not de-escalation, as you mentioned. And so we need to put the folks who are trained in that seat, and they need independence and sort of empowerment to do that.
Thank you both. I'm gonna encourage the viewers and listeners to take a look at our captions. We're gonna put some links, particularly to the Department of Justice, the lawsuit you referenced in the first question. Has a lot to do with mental health. There's a lot to do with the things that the Portland Police Department has failed at. And we've been out of compliance, I believe, on and off, but for real, I think the entire time since that settlement happened. Let's talk a little bit about this community safety office that I mentioned a little bit earlier that really came out of 2020. That is this separate office. I believe it still reports directly to the mayor. What are your thoughts about? I know you mentioned like we should have multiple alternatives. We should be you mentioned experimentation and testing things out. Should that be the charge of this office? I think a lot of Portlanders, including myself, we question like, what do they do really? What are they into right now? I know there's some great folks working, but yeah, bureaucracy makes it hard. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's like a lot of these little boards and bureaus and advisory teams that are all sort of being tried out. And I think that there's also with the new government restructuring, I think all of the committees are going to get reformed again. So it's really unclear right now how much is set in stone versus how much is going to change in January. And so it's a lot to follow, to be honest. But yeah, there's a lot of pushback on different purviews for that community safety office. And I think, maybe it looks like, trying things out. Like, what are other cities doing that are really successful programs that we can bring here? How can we separate out, like, calls for mental health versus calls for addiction situations or overdoses versus, how can we separate out these services so that we're sending the right people to the right situation and sort of being a little bit of an oversight there, but then also just looking at, just doing a lot of research in the community about what is working and what's successful. What do people need? What do people want?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We still have some more time. Just wanted to open up to have some more thoughts. Let's talk about the budget. Let's talk about the fact that it has been slashed over and over, and the rhetoric we're hearing from the current council. You said something spicy before, but actually I don't think it was very spicy. I think it's being mindful of what are our police trained to do. You shared a little bit about that history. What are they constantly being reinformed to do? And it's not mental health services. Let's talk a little bit more about what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I'll make a little connection to my military service. So my job in the Army was civil affairs, which I used to describe it before I realized how cringe it was as like Peace Corps with a gun. But the idea was like, if you're going to be overseas and you're trying to build rapport, you don't want to send the infantry in to do that. Okay, and it's really not a great analogy because I don't want to link Portland Street Response to like the Army because that's not an occupying force, but there's a lesson there. Like the most important thing to do is build rapport and trust, and like absolutely leave the weapon in the car and take that risk, right? And so I think that to get to the point, if you were to throw a lot of like, let's scale up all the infantry soldiers you want, you'll never win the hearts and minds. Right? By putting a whole division of infantry on a town, you'll never win the hearts and minds. But you might be able to do so with a small team of civil affairs soldiers that are trained with culture, that are trained with like de-escalation techniques. And so I think it translates to our budget. If we want good return on investment, we need to recognize that like your police to per capita ratio is not the metric. It's not. It's like what are the skill sets and what is the commitment to the mission about for the folks that you're trying to resource here. So if you want to build trust in the community, you need to bring people in who like their first purview is like worried about whether I'm gonna go home tonight. And so I'm gonna draw my weapon first. Like you can't bring that person into that situation. You need to bring someone in who's like, I came into this work because I'm willing to take a risk for this community. And I'm focused on mental health. I'm focused on addiction. I'm focused on connecting a nexus of service. You're going to get more ROI from that. That's a better way to use the budget.
Thank you.